Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon and to share with you some of the findings from our sort of summer research deep dive into preparedness for the upcoming key dates around Brexit and the temperature of chambers around the country some 8 months into the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the EU-UK trade deal coming into effect. To share initially just some thoughts from our trade confidence survey from the second quarter of this year. In this, we had data from 2,800 companies across the UK from the Chambers network. And the picture was somewhat mixed in terms of how the TCA had worked. So 27% said they had seen an increase in exports, and that was up 7% since the first quarter. But 28% said that they'd seen a decrease. Now that was down from very large decreases that were being reported by 41% of export companies in the BCC in the first quarter. But this figure of 28% is still a historic high. So we are seeing some slight recovery, and that's borne out by the Office for National Statistics trade figures per month. But we're still seeing structural problems in terms of goods leaving Great Britain for the European Union. And in terms of imports from the EU into the UK, we're still seeing very striking and very large declines in trade. So manufacturing exporters were much more likely to see rising sales than those exporting services. I think we would have expected that, given the level of restrictions within the trade agreement in terms of service access and labour mobility, and the restrictions on being able to service clients and also pitch for new clients in the European Union if you're a GB business. And what we saw again from this survey was respondents saying that it was issues with the TCA that were a major barrier to growing their overseas sales in the future. And companies that responded were citing issues from Brexit as really the main cause with their performance in the second quarter of this year. Companies were pointing to the complexity of doing trades, all of the additional red tape and paperwork and processes, goods being lost, problems with import VAT in the country the goods were being sold in. So very much a worrying picture. Now, some of the key deadlines that are upcoming are going to have a significant impact upon our export trade with the EU. So on the 1st of July, new processes came in on import VAT. So if you're a GB retailer, different provisions in Northern Ireland. So if you're a seller from Great Britain, selling to customers in the EU, then you've got to use the one-stop shop, the IOSS, for goods that are worth under €150. And that is a new process. The early data from members has been that they found its introduction has been acceptable. People are not having too many problems with using the interface. However, the structural problems still remain in that this only covers purchases of under €150. And if you're selling consignments above that in value, you've got to use the burdensome processes still with your freight forwarder or your customs agent. And as we've seen, customers can be upset if they're confronted with large VAT bills, even for things like transit and insurance, which they had not anticipated they were going to have to pay when ordering that consignment. So we're still seeing, despite the 1st of July being a bit of a banner day for exporters on VAT, still seeing some real challenges for GB exporters with import VAT processes. Now, as we get to the 1st of January of next year, the easements on proof of rules of origin within the TCA will expire unless there's a last-minute extension. And that means for goods which are being exported from Great Britain to the European Union, those will require either an exporter certificate, or the importer will have to make use of importer's knowledge in order to have the evidential basis of being able to access the zero tariffs within the trade agreement. So that's something that might not be at the top of people's mind, but it is a coming deadline, and people should be aware that some of the processes you've been using to get goods across tariff-free since the 1st of January will change as a result of that easement going. Now, one of the important deadlines that was coming very soon was around CE marking. And of course, this very week, we've had major developments on that front. So we can report that as a result of a campaign led by us at the BCC, we've seen an extension of that easement, which allows CE marked goods onto the GB market, including spare parts, including components, until the 1st of January 2023. And there is, of course, a different easement for medical devices that lasts until the 1st of July 2023. And of course, different provisions will operate in Northern Ireland with separate markings there, but CE marked goods being allowed to move freely within the Northern Ireland market. So we've managed to get a reprieve, but the issue is still a live one. And I think it is a really fundamental one for many manufacturing supply chains that as things stand, even after this week, on the 1st of January 2023, you would have to eliminate CE marked components from manufactured supply chains based in the UK because those goods would not be able to be put onto the market. Now, I know that this causes enormous difficulty and hardship, and we've been working very hard with Greater Birmingham Chamber and the rest of the Chambers network to make sure government is aware of this. That led to the action we saw this week. But we're aware that we've really kind of got to half time. The other half of the game is still to come, and we need to make sure that there is a solution which works for business, which means that your supply chains are protected, remain efficient, and we will be speaking with you about the best way that we can preserve CE marked goods being part of our purchasing and manufactured supply chains for many years to come. Now, in terms of some of the other deadlines coming up, you'll be aware that on the 1st of October, very important deadlines in terms of food products being imported. Remember, we've really seen just the application of border controls on exports at this point. So on imports from the EU, pre-notification on products of animal origin will begin on the 1st of October. So that means that you require to pre-notify your intention to send consignments of goods, including products like cheese up to fillet steaks and everything in between, ingredients from egg to cake mix with dried milk. All of those products will require to have an export health certificate and pre-notification from the 1st of October. Now, we understand that there will not be checks at the border control post on the 1st of October. Those are going to wait until January, but you've got to start having that paperwork ready if you and your supplier are bringing those types of products into Great Britain from the 1st of October. From the 1st of January, we anticipate that we'll begin to see checking of food certification. There may well be physical checks conducted on the goods. And of course, the 1st of January is also the key date for customs declarations beginning at the time that the goods are coming in. For a year, we've had an easement whereby there's been a sort of delayed notification. That will stop on the 1st of January, and declarations will have to be made alongside presentation of the goods as they enter the GB border. So some very important events coming up that companies should be preparing for, getting the best guidance from your Greater Birmingham Chamber, ensuring that you know what you and your suppliers are expected to do and when, what paperwork you're going to need. And that's really going to be, I think, another really important staging point in this process. I always like to think of Brexit being a kind of process rather than a single event. And so that's a really important deadline that is coming up. I think after the 1st of January, things will bed down somewhat. Most of the rules would be in place. There will be some issues around, medical devices where, there's a few months more. This new provision now, of course, on CE marking will go into 2023. But broadly, most of the regulations and rules about bringing goods in and out of Great Britain will be in place and enforced by the 1st of January. Now, the area, of course, where there is still significant doubt is in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. The UK government has announced that in its command paper that it wants to effectively terminate the arrangements. So taking away customs declarations on goods going from GB to NI, taking away the requirement for export health certificates, ending the situation in terms of import VAT on those goods movements. So that is their intention. They hope to negotiate that with the European Union. We will see where they get to in that respect. It will take both sides to agree. And in the meantime, it looks very much as if we're going to have easements until October, but then there is the prospect that those easements could be extended in EU-UK negotiations next month. Perhaps not extended indefinitely, but extended for a while. And so that would mean, if that is what transpires, that companies would not have to have customs declarations on individual packages moving from GB to NI. There would be no requirement for full export health certificates, and the other easements such as UK Trader Scheme and the Digital Advice Service would remain in place. So it may well be that we go into next year still with standstill arrangements on Northern Ireland. Again, you should contact either BCC or Greater Birmingham Chamber in terms of getting specialist advice on goods movements to Northern Ireland. So that is really a summary of what is to come. A very intense period, in a sense, the second half of Brexit. And we look forward to answering your questions later on how it's going to work for you and for your customers.
Thank you, William. That was a really detailed overview of some of the upcoming deadlines, but also some of the ongoing challenges which businesses are still facing. I think the point that you made around the importance of keeping that dialogue going and interacting with chambers across the country, just so we can get that on the ground feedback and share it with decision makers, is obviously still very important. Could I now bring in Nicola, please?
Hi Raj, afternoon everybody. My name is Nicola Smith. I am a regulatory lawyer and I specialise particularly in regulations affecting products made of all types of materials, including consumer products, food and drinks and food contact materials, but also machinery and products subject to requirements for things like electronic equipment, electromagnetic compatibility, and goods which require conformity marking. And as such, what I do is advise businesses on what they need to do to comply with product safety and labelling laws, and the authorisations that they might need to sell certain products in certain markets. And then if something goes wrong, advising on dealing with the enforcement authorities in those circumstances. And I have been seeing a number of queries over recent weeks and months, as you might expect, from businesses who are supplying or buying machinery and other products which are or were subject to EU product laws, around the impact of Brexit on those products and conformity and labelling requirements, both in terms of the new UK conformity assessment or UKCA mark to replace the CE mark, but also in terms of the impacts of Brexit on things like name and address labelling requirements, and connected issues with getting products which are marked under those regimes across border. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So today I'm going to give a brief overview and description of the current position in relation to the UKCA mark, requirements for UK declarations of conformity, the impact of Brexit and those changing product regimes in terms of economic operators that are based in the UK, and what that means for name and address labelling. And I'm also going to touch on how the enforcement regime impacts upon how authorities will interpret these various provisions before we move on to Q&A. So if we can have the next slide, please. So to start with, I wanted to turn to the impact particularly of Brexit on conformity assessment markings before we go on to look at the grace periods for this, because I think a general explanation of what conformity assessment markings do can help to explain what's needed in terms of the grace periods and the ultimate application date for the regulations. And hopefully many of you, or indeed all of you, will be familiar with the CE mark, which is on the right of your screen. But just by way of reminder, that is a mark that's been used in the EU and the UK for a number of years now, for many types of product. And I'm sure that most of you will be aware that the CE mark is an indicator of a product's compliance with EU legislation, although it isn't itself proof of that compliance. It is just an indicator. And what it says is essentially that the product is being declared by the manufacturer of that product or the importer into the EU or by in some circumstances by a notified body who is certifying compliance of that product as being in conformity with harmonised EU rules for that particular product. And most new products have to be marked with the CE mark in the EU. So that includes things like machinery to indicate compliance with the EU's machinery directive. It includes products which are electrical equipment to indicate compliance with the low voltage directive and the electromagnetic compatibility rules. It also covers things like construction products and also many consumer products like toys, for example, aerosols and medical devices, which all have requirements for CE marking. Although there are some products which don't fall under these specific regimes. CE marking, it's not like a kite mark. It's not intended to serve commercial purposes. It's not intended to be a marketing tool to help you get the product on the market. And in my experience, that can be a fairly common misconception because many people do think of it like a kite mark. But I guess it can help to indicate to customers or consumers that a product does comply with those EU requirements. But actually what the CE marking is there for is to be the visible result of a whole process of conformity assessment. And what I mean by that is checking that the particular product complies with the requirements of the relevant EU laws for that product, which in many cases will involve compliance with a particular standard for that type of product. The way in which you confirm conformity depends very much on the product type. For some, it's a process of self-assessment. For others, which are generally those products that have got higher and stricter safety standards, or where the product hasn't followed a recognised ISO standard, conformity has to be assessed and confirmed by one of those notified bodies, by which I mean somebody like BSI or TUV or SGS, who assess the product in line with the regulations. And those notified, those products which are confirmed as conforming with the regulations by Great British notified bodies in Great Britain, I should say, had to transfer to notified bodies in the EU before we left the European Union at the end of December to remain valid, because notified bodies in Great Britain can no longer, they're not allowed to certify compliance with EU standards. So that's something that people on the call may have already had to do in preparation for Brexit. The CE mark also enables the free movement of the product in the EU, regardless of where it's manufactured. And that's because countries in the EU aren't allowed to restrict the placing on the market of CE marked products unless that can be justified on the basis of evidence. So in short, there's a presumption that a product that's CE marked complies with relevant requirements, rather than a presumption that it doesn't. But following Brexit, for sales of products in Great Britain, that CE mark on the right is being replaced by the UKCA mark on the left. And the reason that it's worthwhile remembering what the CE mark represents, which I've just run through for the purposes of the EU market, is because very similar principles are going to apply to the UKCA mark for the Great Britain market. So that UKCA mark will essentially be confirming the conformity of the product, but in the case of the UKCA mark, it will be conformity with the relevant UK regulations rather than conformity with the EU regulations, albeit in practice the two may well be, and probably for most products will be very similar, as we'll come on to. Now, that UKCA mark declares conformity like the CE mark, whether it's on the basis of self-declaration or confirmation by a notified body, depending on the product type. And also within Great Britain, similarly to the CE mark in the EU, that UKCA mark is going to allow access to the UK market and a presumption of conformity with the UK regulations. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So looking at the UKCA markings in summary, as it says on the slides, the UKCA mark is going to affect all of those products which are placed on the market in Great Britain from the 1st of January 2021 and which previously had to be CE marked, subject to the grace periods, of course, which we'll come on to. And that replacement mark, as we've said, is UKCA, which stands for UK Conformity Assessment. Now, as at the 1st of January this year, the UK Standards and Conformity Assessment process was actually identical to the CE marking process because part of the exit process was that on exit day, UK law would essentially be carried over as retained law. EU law would essentially carry over as retained law into the UK legal system. Because of that, the EU laws remain subject to some minor amendments just to make them work technically for the UK market. And the UK guidance specifically says about standards in terms of product standards that there are no plans to diverge at this time. So it seems likely that the standards will remain aligned between UK products and between EU product requirements for some time yet. Now, as has already been mentioned, there was a grace period for compliance with the requirement to add a UKCA mark to many products, and the deadline for that first grace period was due to end at the end of this year. But as of yesterday, which is always the way I think when you're preparing a presentation, as of yesterday, the grace periods changed and the government announced that they were going to allow an extra year for introduction of the UKCA mark. So the grace periods as they now stand mean that until the 31st of December 2022, you can continue to use the CE mark. You don't have to use the UKCA mark until the 1st of January 2023. Now, if you want to use the UKCA mark in the meantime, you can do. But as I say, the new grace periods mean that you don't have to now use the UKCA mark until the 1st of January 2023, with some exceptions. And I think it's worth remembering, just before we move on to the exceptions, that as we've already said, not all products have to be assessed by a notified body. There are a number of products that can be self-assessed and declared to be compliant with the applicable regulations. And it's only sort of those higher test products, higher safety standard products, which are going to need assessing by a notified body. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. And these are some exceptions to the general rule. The first being Northern Ireland, which, as I'm sure you'll be aware, is a special case because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And therefore products which are being placed on the market in Northern Ireland have to keep the CE mark even after the 1st of January 2022. The second exemption is in relation to products which are for the market in Great Britain. and that hadn't already been fully manufactured before the start of this year, and which did require third-party conformity assessment by a notified body as part of the CE marking process. And essentially, as it says on the slides, if you hadn't transferred your notified body to an EU body before the end of 2020, then your CE certificate would be invalidated, and you would need to use the UKCA mark straight away from January 2021. So that is one of the exceptions to that general rule, although because of the fact that many products can be self-declared as compliant, that doesn't apply to every type of product. And then the final exception on the note, as it says, is that if the EU decides to change requirements so that the CE mark and the UKCA mark no longer are aligned in terms of the standards being the same that you're confirming conformity to, then you won't be able to use, if they change, you wouldn't be able to use the CE mark for sale in the GB market, because the GB standards would be different and the products would need to be to a slightly different specification. If we can move the slides on, please. And there were some further transitional provisions, which, in addition to that grace period, which you can see on the slide, was the previous position, which for ease of comparison, I've kept on there, but taken out in red text, because you may be thinking that from the end of this year, you've got to use the UKCA mark, but you can put it on an accompanying document. It doesn't have to be on the product itself. Because that was the transitional provision that up until yesterday, when the guidance changed, we had been told would apply. So we were working on the basis that after the end of this year, you'd need to use that UKCA mark on an accompanying document if it wasn't on the product itself. But that has now changed. That sort of interim solution, if you like, for next year has gone. And instead, the guidance now says that you don't need to use the UKCA mark until the 1st of January 2023. But there is no kind of interim step, if you like, from the 1st of January 2023. It has to go on the product itself. So we've missed out the middle part where you can put it on an accompanying document. Instead, from the 1st of January 2023, you will need to use the UKCA mark on the product itself, unless the regulations allow you to put it on an accompanying document. And that would be the specific product regulations for your particular product type. So if you were allowed to put your CE mark on an accompanying document, you will be permitted under the UK regulations to put your UKCA mark on an accompanying document, because they will have carried over in the same way. But if you have always attached your CE mark to the product itself, the UKCA mark would need to go on the product itself from the 1st of January 2023. I've just flagged though on that slide that there are, just to be careful around this, there are some products where the transitional provisions don't apply in the same way, where UKCA marking would have had to have been used already. So we won't go into those details now, but it is just worth bearing in mind that the transitional provisions that we're talking about here are general transitional provisions that apply to most products, but it is worth checking the position for your particular product if you're not sure. And then the final note on that slide is around placing on the market. And I've flagged placing on the market because it's very possible that goods will continue to be sold in Great Britain without the UKCA marking past the relevant transitional dates, because the requirement is in relation to the UKCA mark being on products that are placed on the market after the relevant transitional date. So you need to think about what does placing on the market mean in that context. And it's at least arguable that products are placed on the market in Great Britain legally before they're actually physically imported into the Great Britain market. And that's because according to guidance under product rules, which was in a document called the Blue Guide, which is an EU guide to product rules, and which has also been repeated and referred to in some UK guidance. A fully manufactured good is placed on the market when there's an agreement or an offer of an agreement to transfer the ownership or possession of the rights in the product to another party. So when you're agreeing to exchange the ownership of that product, and that doesn't require the physical transfer of the good. So it's possible that you could prove that a product is placed on the market before it's actually shipped to Great Britain. But all of that is guidance rather than law. So it is quite difficult to see how that is going to be applied in practice. And I think it's right to say that the economic operator in the relevant market, so let's say it's the UKCA mark and the economic operator in Great Britain, whether it be the importer or the manufacturer or the distributor in Great Britain, is going to bear the burden of proof for demonstrating that the good was placed on the market before the relevant date. So all of the documents that prove the date of the sale of specific goods in the UK market should be retained, because they may be important in future for confirming that your good was placed on the market before the relevant provisions on UKCA marking came into effect. So bringing all of that together, in summary, for most products up to the end of next year, so up until the 31st of December 2022, you won't need to have a UKCA mark on the product, but you can do if you want to. Until this week, throughout the whole of next year, you would have had to have had a UKCA mark on an accompanying document, but the announcement yesterday is that was changing, so you've got effectively an extra year before the UKCA marking is mandatory. And after that period, so from the 1st of January 2023, you need to treat the UKCA mark in Great Britain like you would have done the CE mark in the EU. So it's going to have to be affixed to the product in most cases. If you're manufacturing the product, you will normally be responsible for affixing that UKCA mark in accordance with the relevant regulations, but your distributors will still have the responsibilities to check that the right mark is on there. And if you are the distributor or the importer, you will obviously need to make those checks. We can just move on to the next slide, please. I also just wanted to touch on the Declaration of Conformity, because I think it's something that hasn't received quite as much coverage in terms of what's changing as part of Brexit. I've already explained about the CE mark being the mark that designates that the conformity assessment has been done in accordance with EU law. But of course, when the UKCA mark comes in, that is effectively the indication that you're complying with UK laws, not EU laws. So it's right to say that you are going to have a UK Declaration of Conformity, which is a document that will have to be drawn up, if not already, for most products that are lawfully bearing a UKCA marking. That Declaration of Conformity will be in a very similar form, in fact almost identical for your EU Declaration of Conformity, but obviously it will be headed slightly differently to refer to the UK market, and it will also need to list UK laws to the extent that those laws are different to the EU laws. Essentially, if your product is governed by or was governed by a directive that would have been implemented into the UK under UK regulations, and it's the UK regulations that you need to quote rather than the EU directive. So there's a slightly different change of emphasis there, and just something that is not difficult to do, but just does need to be crossed off. I've added a note at the bottom of that slide to say that there are manufacturer and importer responsibilities for the CE mark and the UKCA mark, and that is what we've just been talking about essentially in relation to the responsibilities for either affixing or checking the UKCA mark. Similarly, there will still be manufacturer responsibilities and importer or distributor responsibilities into that conformity assessment process more widely. So for example, the manufacturer is still going to be responsible for carrying out the conformity assessment process, setting up the technical file, issuing the declaration of conformity, etc. Whereas the importer will still be responsible for checking the presence of the right marking, checking that the necessary supporting documents are in place at manufacturer level, and if you're importing from outside of Great Britain, checking that the manufacturer has complied with the certification requirements that he needs to under UK laws. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Some other but connected impacts of Brexit on labelling that arise because EU product laws have been transposed into UK law as part of the Brexit arrangements, but with the replacement of references in that legislation to the EU market to the UK market. That means that if a business in Great Britain buys products from an EU manufacturer, that business in Great Britain will become the importer into Great Britain, whereas they would never previously legally have been considered an importer, because when Great Britain was part of the EU, it was all one single market. And because of that, they're going to bear similar responsibilities now for those products to the manufacturer, if the manufacturer was based in Great Britain, in terms of checking that a product complies. So what that means is that if even if your supply chain is the same, the manufacturer's based in the EU and they're shipping to you in the UK, you'll potentially be bearing more responsibilities for product compliance now, because you're the importer into the GB market and therefore need to make sure that the products comply with UK laws. Also connected with that, there may be a change in the name and address that needs to appear on the product, because under most EU product laws, which are coming over which have come over into UK laws, so for example under the machinery directive or under the low voltage directive and lots of other product specific roles, if the manufacturer is based outside of the market, so in this case, if the manufacturer is based outside of Great Britain, the name and address of the importer needs to be given. So again, if a product's manufactured in the EU, there will now be a separate importer into the UK whose details have to be given on the product label. And the same is true the other way around as well. So if you're manufacturing in the UK and exporting to the EU, in most cases, the product rules will require the name and address of the importer into the EU to go on the product label, as well as your details as manufacturer in the UK. Overall, what this means is there is a much greater focus on labels and label compliance by people in supply chains. So we are seeing, I mentioned at the outset, we're seeing lots more questions around labelling, including name and address. And that's because customers, both sides of the EU border, are now looking more carefully at what has to go on the label, not just in terms of name and address, but also more broadly at things like languages, whether instructions for use have to be with the product, and there's actually been no change in terms of the substance of those requirements post-Brexit. But as I say, because people are looking at the labels more closely, we're seeing lots more questions around issues like that. If we can just move on to the last slide, please. Thank you. And finally, I just wanted to touch, I mean, enforcement is a massive, massive topic, but I just wanted to touch on the way that product laws that are enforced. And as you'll see on the slide, in the EU, even though there are sort of regulations which apply directly across all member states, or directives which set principles which apply across all member states, the actual enforcement on the ground of product safety rules is done under national implementing legislation, which will set things like penalties, which authorities can enforce product rules and how, whether that be by prosecution or whether that be by an administrative fine and so on. That is governed country to country. So that can change depending on which country your products are going to. Some enforcement authorities will be very proactive in terms of monitoring products that are coming into the market and challenging compliance. Enforcement authorities in other countries will have more targeted enforcement based on intelligence around particular issues. So you may need to consider where your product is going in terms of where it's actually being imported to when you think about how the legislation is going to be interpreted in relation to your particular product. It's also worth saying that there's been a new regulation coming into force this year in the EU, which is called the Market Surveillance Regulation. And that was intended to ensure that for certain products sold in the EU, market surveillance authorities have a point of contact in the EU, which will generally be the importer or the manufacturer's authorised representative, or in some circumstances, the delivery company. And under that regulation, a product compliance network database of enforcement data is being introduced, which will include information on things like product testing and enforcement and remediation actions. So we're going to have to watch this space as to how that plays out in practice, but there may be a more coordinated approach in future. In the UK, I would say that enforcement is generally proportionate and risk-based, but as the new rules for UKCA marking become more embedded, and certainly after the grace periods have ended, I think we will see more enforcement of these rules over the coming years. I'm sorry, I think that was a very quick gallop through quite a complicated area, but hopefully that's been helpful as an overview.
Very helpful, Nicola. Thank you so much. Really fascinating insight there into not just obviously conformity markings, but other practical issues that firms are likely to face as well moving forward. So we've got just under 10 minutes or so for a couple of questions from both the audience and myself. So one question we've had from the audience, Nicola, this is probably for yourself to answer. So a question from Katie Webborn, who says, UKCA, we're a UK distributor for electrical and electronic products selling goods which are manufactured in the EU. We are currently going through the process of self-declaring UKCA for all of our CE goods. What happens with goods which were manufactured before the 1st of January 2023, but still only have the CE printed on the product? Can these still be resold and used by machine builders if we have the paper certificate, but it is not physically printed on the goods? We have a large quantity of stock and it will not all be resold by the 1st of January 2023.
It's a really good question, and it's one that is probably top of the list in terms of the queries that I'm getting, which is about stock management. And the answer is you have to determine when those products were placed on the market, and the sort of when the manufacturing process is complete is not necessarily the same as the product being placed on the market, because placed on the market requires that sort of first making available for use, I think, is the definition of the legislation. So essentially there needs to be an agreement whereby you're transferring the ownership or the possession of that product for use in the relevant market. So if you have got a product with only CE on that has not been placed on the market before the 1st of January 2023, then it should not be placed on the market after that date with only the CE mark. It would need the UKCA mark to be added. But as I say, there are some quite complicated questions as to when the products are going to be placed on the market.
Thanks, Nicola. We've also had a question from Kath, who says, is there any change to items coming into the UK from ROW, not EU? So I presume ROW means rest of the world.
Well, yes. So just in terms of conformity marking, previously products which were governed by other regulations, by specific regulations, so machinery directive, etc. If they were coming into UK, would have had to have had a CE mark on, even though they're coming from elsewhere. But now they will have to have the UKCA mark on from the 1st of January 2023. And they will also need to have that UK declaration of conformity, whereas I suspect at the moment they've only got an EU declaration of conformity.
Thanks, Nicola. William, a couple of questions for yourself. Now, obviously at the Chamber, we're dealing with the full fallout from not just Brexit, but also the pandemic as well. But I mean, to what extent do you think the fallout from COVID-19 has had an impact on some of the practical issues that firms are facing in attempting to comply with some of these regulations, particularly if we think about what's going on in the construction industry, some of the practical issues they're facing around material shortages, but also I'm thinking obviously not being able to go abroad and maybe go and see how some of these kind of safety standards need to be adhered to. Is that something that you've picked up across the ground as well?
Well, there's no doubt that the pandemic has sort of robbed firms of bandwidth to do anything other than, survive, keep the business going, make sure that customers can get served and look after staff, some of whom might be on furlough. So certainly I think it has reduced the amount of time people have had to think about, what they have to do to comply with the TCA and some of the other changes that flow from that. Clearly as well, we are seeing problems with raw material costs, things like steel and cardboard, inflationary pressures, shortages of HGV drivers, shortages of food processors. There's a sort of perfect storm hitting the economy at the moment, which if it's not sorted out, could lead to, higher inflation and higher prices for ordinary consumers. So there's a lot of bad stuff which, is going on. Some of it is in connection, as you say, to the pandemic. Shipping costs in some cases have gone up 7-fold over the past year. So that's a function of supply chains globally being a bit skewed by what happened last February and last March. But some of it is down to the nature of the Brexit deal that was put through very hurriedly on Christmas Eve last year. And one of the things that we've been doing with Lord Frost and with other ministers is saying, well, on a practical sense, you may have signed this, but it's not in a position for businesses to actually implement it or be prepared to operate this until or unless you have some significant easements. So I think the CE marking issue has fallen into that bucket of issues. But we've also got issues around customs, rules of origin, where the sort of carousel of goods between the EU and the UK, which people kind of took for granted under the single market. That's much more difficult now. You need to use things like return goods relief and customs warehousing, and it's a bit easier for bigger companies than it is for SMEs to do that. So I think CE marking is part of that sort of group of major practical transitional issues that businesses are now having to comply with, but with limited bandwidth.
Sure, and just following up from that, because I'm obviously conscious of time as well, but you mentioned this kind of bucket list of practical issues. Do you foresee any further extension of easement periods for some of those other issues, for example, rules of origin, for example, you mentioned earlier?
I think that one is more difficult because in that sense, firms have had to operate that since the 1st of January. The customs union ended for the UK at 11 o'clock on the 31st of December last year. So firms are really using these now. That's where it's different from CE marking, where the vast majority of firms are not using UKCA at the moment anyway. So it's an easement before a sort of new system is introduced. So I think it's a lot easier to look at prolonging easements if there's a strong business and regulatory case to do so, if companies are still using the old system by and large. On rules of origin, we've already shifted. And so therefore, I think in that sense, what the BCC has asked the government for is, to get clear guidance from itself, but also to seek that from the European Commission on how best to put together options, using customs warehousing and return goods relief in order to get the best outcome for companies, depending on what scenario of movement of goods they've got involved. Sometimes firms are using transit procedures, sometimes they're using ordinary movement procedures. So we need to work out better guidance which provides clear and unambiguous support for companies on how to mitigate the risk of second unwanted tariffs.
Of course, and I guess even with the extension to the CE marking transition, I guess we're calling on the government to use the next 14 months or so to iron out these issues and really, again, keep speaking to businesses to understand what the real world challenges they're facing right now and understand how they can be overcome in that time period. Nicola, we've just got one very last question before we finish up. So it's from Katie Webble again saying, thank you for answering my question. For goods with CE marking, do goods have to be placed on the market in the UK, or can they be placed on the market in the EU prior to the 1st of January 2023? For example, if a distributor in Europe has residual stock which has been available for sale for several years and is so only marked with CE, can we still import it and resell it after the 1st of January 2023?
Well, just trying to unpick that a little bit. If a product has got CE marking, it will still be able to be sold in the EU. So you can. So if it's placed on, but however, so if you've got a product that's in the EU in a warehouse with a CE mark, can it be imported into the UK for sale in the UK after the 1st of January 2023? Well, I should say for sale in Great Britain because of the Northern Ireland exception. Well, the answer to that is no, if it's going to be placed on the market after the 1st of January 2023. But if you want to bring it into the UK for selling back to the EU after that date, then you could do that because there's the definitions of placing on the market exclude things that are in transit for sale elsewhere. So you could bring a CE marked product into the UK for sale back into the EU, but there might be some complexities around whether it's stopped at customs, etc., which would be discussions that would need to be had with the customs authorities at that time, and probably sensible to reflect it on customs declarations that it's not intended for the market in Great Britain.
No, thank you, Nicola. I'm conscious of time, and obviously we've just gone over there. So really just wanted to say thank you so much to both our presenters, to William and to Nicola, and to all of yourselves for joining us today. My colleague Grace will be sending out a survey after the webinar just to get your feedback on the content that we covered and whether there's any additional information or support you'd like moving forward. Again, if there's specific questions that you have for either Nicola or William, please do feel free to get in touch with my colleague, and we can put you in touch with them directly if you've got specific queries or further advice that you'd like to gather. And all that's left for me to say is thank you very much for joining us today, and hope we see you again soon. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks all.